Looking specifically for lessons learned, looking for how to prevent the same mistakes from being made over and over again. You look back and Uvalde is Columbine, right? We have the same problems that keep recurring. And unfortunately, with no centralized lessons learned mechanism for law enforcement, an agency can have a catastrophe and experience a lot of things and learn those lessons. But if those lessons aren't shared, every other agency is going to experience the same problem.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? That's something that I try to focus on in training as well. Why are they not learning the lessons? You talked about it in some of your podcasts where guys will go on a search warrant 1,000 times. There'd be a couple of close calls. They're like, oh, that was a close one. And then they never really take time to sit down and debrief it, if you will. Why do you think that is a thing in law enforcement?
I think it's a couple things. I think there is, on an individual agency basis, everybody's busy, everybody's, running as fast as they can. And in law enforcement, a formal mechanism for after action doesn't exist for a lot of agencies. So if they have a successful operation, hey, it's great, high fives, off we go. If they have a bad operation, a failure, an officer injury, God forbid, a line of duty death, everybody kind of scrambles to cover their ass, to put it bluntly. And so there isn't a culture for a lot of agencies of trying to learn from both positive and negative experiences. I think on a national basis, because there are so many small law enforcement agencies, right? We have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. There isn't a centralized mechanism for sharing lessons learned. And so what happens is, an agency in New Mexico has a horrible experience, but nobody outside of the agencies right around them hears about it because nobody wants to go embrace failure, which we really advocate doing is when things go sideways, learn the lessons, share the lessons. Don't try to cover them up. But I think those two combine to create a culture and a system where we're not really sharing our lessons learned.
Yeah. Yeah, I just experienced that as well. There was an incident happened in New Mexico a couple of years ago. Didn't really make the news. It was a use of force incident where there was a death, and the 3 of the officers were charged federally under Section 242. And I kind of used that as a learning point or teaching point in training here in New Mexico. It happened here in New Mexico, and every agency I talk about, they haven't even heard of it. And there is a lot of lessons to be learned from that case. So you're right that not having a centralized place to do it, huge. But you seem to tap into something with your podcast because now, the last time we talked, you were just getting it fired up. Now you got a ton of episodes out there, and you've talked to a lot of people, not just here, but you've talked to people overseas, kind of broad lessons learned, anything from legal issues to medical to tactical operations, all kinds of good stuff. One case in particular that I thought that I want to talk a little bit about, that I think there was a lot of misinformation on. So how can we take lessons from it if we don't even know what happened? But your podcast seemed to kind of get down to what a more accurate version of what happened. And there are a lot of lessons from it. And that's the Breonna Taylor case. What was your takeaway on, what actually happened in that case and what can we learn from that?
So it's interesting. I don't believe in a grand media conspiracy. Like I don't think that the media conspires against law enforcement. I think the media will report anything that attracts eyes, and the more sensational it is, the more sets of eyes you get. But if I was going to believe in a grand media conspiracy, Breonna Taylor was the case that would make me do that.
For sure.
It was fascinating to me as I dug into the case how what I had heard in the media was completely inaccurate. The themes of that case that people ran with, that Breonna Taylor was shot in her bed, that they were at the wrong house, that they had executed a no-knock warrant on the house, were directly disputed just by the physical evidence. Yeah. Like you didn't have to be a math major to figure out, like Breonna Taylor is found dead in a hallway. Her boyfriend shoots a police officer. Yes, they had a no-knock endorsement, but they knocked and noticed, or they wouldn't have been shot outside the door. They would have been shot in the house.
Right.
It was very interesting to me to see how a story caught fire there, And I mean, you had Kamala Harris and Beyonce and, LeBron James and all of these people with giant platforms spreading obviously fake information. And I don't think that they were spreading it intentionally. I think they didn't do any homework on it. And so the story began to run, and there wasn't a strong dispute from Louisville PD. And so what ended up happening was the story got completely out of control. But if you really look at the physical evidence, right, Breonna Taylor was the target of the investigation. She had been holding money for the primary target that they were hitting at a different location. Yes, they had a no-knock warrant. They did not execute it as a no-knock. The upstairs neighbor complained that they were banging on the door.
Yeah, he even came out, right? He came out and there was a confrontation with him.
The thing that was really fascinating was Breonna and her boyfriend, by all accounts, are in bed watching TV when the unit gets there. And they have time to get out of bed, walk out to the hallway, and as soon as they make entry, shoot the first police officer. So John Mattingly, who was a sergeant that was leading the unit, John is shot in the thigh, has a femoral bleed. Fortunately, manages to survive because of some good tourniquet work. But, everything we heard about that case initially was not only wrong, it was immediately disputed by just looking at the physical evidence. Look at the warrant, right? Look at where she was found dead. Look at the fact that a police officer was shot. And I do think that the Breonna Taylor case was a case of mistaken intent on both sides. I think that I don't think her boyfriend knew he was shooting a police officer.
Yeah, the evidence would seem to support that too, because he just shot once.
Yeah, he fires one round, throws the gun, hides under the bed, basically. Unfortunately, he has Breonna on his right side when he does it, and she can't make it out. Can't make it back to the bedroom. It's basically a long hallway with a bedroom off to the right side. They come out of the bedroom. She's on the left, he's on the right. When the team makes entry, he fires one round, which hits John Mattingly in the thigh. The team returns fire, and she's caught in the crossfire. But I think there are a couple of lessons learned from the Breonna Taylor case. I think certainly the notions of dynamic entry versus containing call out were in play there and are a topic for an agency to consider. But I think that probably one of the biggest lessons learned, at least from a legal standpoint or a PIO standpoint, is you've got to get ahead of the messaging. You cannot hide and hope that the media is going to get it right, because they're not. It is important, and you see more and more agencies getting ahead of their shootings, where they come out and they go, here's the body-worn camera. There wasn't any in this case. Here's the physical evidence. Here's the warrant. Here's everything we can disclose. I always use the analogy of a slasher movie. The scariest part of the slasher movie is when you're walking down the hallway and the scary music is playing, and you don't know where the guy is. The minute you see with the guy with the axe, it kind of loses its scariness. Yeah. The same is true police shootings. If the agency gets in front of it and says, like, here's the information, here's what happened, here's what we know, it takes away the ability for the public and for the media to draw, negative conclusions from unknown variables. And that's really what has happened with a lot of the cases, Breonna Taylor being one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, the dynamic entry aspect. When I was a prosecutor, I did for a long time drug cases. I was the height of drug prosecutor, so I worked directly with our drug task force. I even advised them on the law, on how to work a confidential informant. This was probably back in like 2013, 2014, right around that time. That was just the thing that you did. And in New Mexico, you can't have a no-knock warrant, only if you arrive there and there's exigent circumstances. And there was an officer-involved shooting one time, not similarly to Breonna Taylor, but kind of, to me, the lesson learned was it wasn't a tactical team. They were narc cops doing a dynamic entry, so they really didn't train on that sort of thing. And they got a little bit complacent because they were doing so many of them. In this search warrant, they knew there was going to be guns in there as well, but they really didn't take that into consideration. Of course, what happens, they knock the door open with a battering ram. There's a guy standing there with an AK-47 and just dumping the magazine at him. Miraculously, no one was shot or killed in that case. But to me, that's kind of the risk that you run. And we're seeing dynamic entry kind of going the way of the dinosaur now. And these are reasons why, and going towards the contain and call out, right?
Well, I think yes, you certainly are seeing a trend more towards contain and call out. Dynamic tactics work when you have the element of surprise. The challenge is when you stand at the front door and bang on it for 30 seconds or a minute before you make entry. You've lost the element of surprise. And so what we're seeing more and more is teams, if they have a no-knock warrant and they're executing it as a no-knock warrant and they use dynamic tactics, I think you can make an argument that that is an effective, tactical approach. But that is an extremely rare circumstance now in most cases.
Yeah.
Certainly dynamic tactics for hostage rescue are not a question, right? There are circumstances where dynamic movement is absolutely required. The bigger teams now in the United States, for the most part, are saving that specifically for cases where they have to make a crisis entry.
Yeah. A little bit of a side note. It just kind of popped in my head here. What are your thoughts on agencies that use a matrix for making the decision for a SWAT call out? Is that still the norm? Is there a better way to do it? Should they check the matrix?
It's interesting. So I helped to teach in the California Association of Tactical Officers Strategic Leadership Program, and warrant workup or SWAT matrix workups have been a frequent topic, and virtually all of the major teams in the United States are using some form of a matrix or decision-making process. And I think probably what seems to be the consensus opinion right now is that there are certain things that automatically make it a SWAT call out.
Yes.
That there are kind of, this is sufficient, let's call it sufficient conditions. If this happens, then SWAT. I think if you look at the approach that LAPD uses, that all warrants are vetted through SWAT. They're not all executed through SWAT. SWAT actually, executes very few warrants, both in LAPD and LA Sheriff. But they're vetted, which gives them an opportunity to go, hey, have you thought about this? What about this? I think the challenge with a warrant workup like that is it's easy to cook. And what you do see is you see agencies where if the narcotics unit wants to serve it, they downplay information so that they maybe don't hit a threshold. Or if they don't want to do it, they upplay information. So it is this constant battle, right? There's always this tension between units that are serving search warrants and SWAT units, especially in larger agencies. But I think you have to have some kind of a matrix that you apply consistently that determines when it makes sense to move to an alternative tactical strategy.
Yes. Yeah, and legally, from a legal standpoint, I've worked with some SWAT teams, and we talk about, I think the case is McCracken versus Freed, where it can be considered a use of force just from the massive amount. Like if you bring out the tactical team, and if I'm the one found the lawsuit, the tanks and the rocket launchers and all that stuff, that's a significant show of force. So I think having something in place to make that decision, when to activate it and when not. And then also for officer safety, do you really want your patrol guys, going into the house on a search warrant to get the homicide suspect that is armed and dangerous when they're not trained to do that? That was also an issue in Breonna Taylor, I think, right? That was essentially a drug task force. Some of those guys hadn't worked together and they really didn't train much on entry or the tactics behind it. I think that was something that came up, right?
So it's a narcotics unit. Louisville had a SWAT team and they had a narcotics unit. The SWAT team was executing the arrest warrant on the primary subject of the investigation. The narcotics unit was basically looking for paperwork and kind of, let's call it evidence at Breonna Taylor's house. The two units trained differently. SWAT actually executed a contain and call out on the primary suspect, but the narcotics task force, the narcotics unit executed a dynamic, knock and notice, but dynamic.
Yeah.
It ended at the door. So people go, well, it wasn't a dynamic entry because they never entered the building. And yeah, that's true. That's because they were shot as soon as they breached the door. But the intent was certainly dynamic movement. It's interesting though, because it's a very frequent topic now, is this idea of militarization of law enforcement.
Yeah, it is.
And I actually think this is a place that the left probably has it wrong. There's a book written by Radley Balco called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. and it talks about the militarization of law enforcement and how armored vehicles are, they present a military mindset. And certainly there are agencies that need to look at their relationship with their community. But generally speaking, activating SWAT should slow the problem down, right? SWAT actually should decrease the likelihood of a lethal force engagement, right? Because now you're talking about bringing in people with superior tactics, with a higher level of training, a higher level of experience. And when you look at how it plays out in major cities, LA being a very good example, when SWAT is activated in LA, when you push the big red SWAT button, it's because they have somebody who's committed a felony, who's armed or believed to be armed, in a position of advantage, and is refusing to submit.
Yeah.
So you've down selected to a pretty aggressive situation already. And yet LAPD SWAT uses any kind of force at all in less than 8% of their cases, and they use lethal force less than 1.5% of the time.
Right.
Right. And so when you look at a superior show of force, you look at using armor, what you're doing is you're creating a situation where the suspect realizes that resistance is going to be futile, which increases the likelihood of them being able to surrender. And the same is true with using chemical agents. The same is true with using canines. All of the tactics that a SWAT team brings actually create a larger number of menu items to resolve the situation without having to use lethal force.
Right. And I think the key thing and I agree with that. And I think the key is if they are a well-trained SWAT team, if they're getting the right training, not just on the tactics, but the mindset, are they using reality-based training where they can react under stress? That's the thing. And typically, you see a lot of the use of force cases that make the news. It's usually a patrol guy or something like that, or, from a department that just does kind of the check the box training and that's it. And when they're put in that stressful situation and they just react because you only have a second maybe to react, if you don't have the training and you're trying to pull it out of the subconscious, which takes over, as we know from the human performance factors, that's when mistakes can be made. So the well-trained aspect, you're right. And that's a perfect point.
Well, it's funny because one of my mentors, a guy named Sid Hale, who was a commander at LA County Sheriff's Department, I think put it best when he was talking about, SWAT teams interacting with suspects. He said that the suspect in the house has made so many bad life choices that the sheriff is knocking down their door with a SWAT team. And we're going to give this guy a split of a second to make the right decision. What are the odds he gets it right when his entire life has been bad decisions? Let's just slow everything down and give him some time to think about it. And maybe he's a little more likely to make the right choice. And I think that's what people don't understand, that a well-trained team, the one that always drives me crazy is armor. People say, the police are bringing tanks, they're doing this. Yeah. And the example I always use is if the SWAT team has armor and the suspect shoots at them, they can make a decision as to whether they want to engage the suspect. If they don't have a choice.
That's true.
They have to shoot back. And there's so many cases in the last couple of years of where the SWAT team is, buttoned up in armor with a guy in the turret and the suspect is shooting at him and they don't shoot him back because they have time. They are protected. Really the goal of most tactical teams is to slow things down, create distance, and try to put the suspect in a position that he realizes he's not going to win.
Right. Yes. Excellent point. So I want to move on to another topic that you've discussed at length on the podcast. You've had some guests on, and I think it was a topic you discussed at your recent training as well, and that's leadership, investing in leaders and what role that plays in kind of a healthy department. What's your message on that? What have you kind of learned from the podcast when it comes to leadership?
So, it is fascinating to me how bad the culture in law enforcement is right now, and how little we are spending training law enforcement. If you look at the way that the military looks at leadership, right, there are formal leadership training programs. Again, yes. Sid Hale, the guy I mentioned previously, used to say by the time I led men in combat for the Marine Corps, they had spent $100,000 in 10 years training me. When I became a captain in the Sheriff's Department, they gave me a new badge. And I think that there is nowhere near enough attention being paid to training leadership in law enforcement and supporting leadership in law enforcement. We're not teaching decision making. We're not teaching incident command. And as a result, the perfect example is Uvalde.
Yeah.
Right. So I just recently interviewed the team that did the DOJ report for Uvalde. It's an episode that'll probably be out in the next 2 months.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
And it's easy to look at that situation and go, oh man, those guys are sissies, whatever. They weren't real men. There were 320 cops there by the time that situation was done. Right. There were SWAT team members. There were all kinds of people. Right. That's not a manliness issue. That's a leadership issue. The chief of police, who has come under a great deal of fire, the chief of the Uvalde School District Police, Arredondo, his entire department was 4 officers. And so he gets to this problem, and the officers do the right thing initially. They immediately charge in. Right? They get to the door where the suspect is with the kids, and the suspect shoots back at them through the door. When they do, the problem is misframed as a barricade. Starts off as an active shooter. It is an active shooter. It's a hostage situation. It needed to be framed that way, but it is misframed as a barricade. And because they're treating it like a barricade, they are making the decisions that you would make in a barricade of, we'll get a SWAT team out here and we'll lock it down and we'll prevent him from fleeing. The problem with that framing is that there are children bleeding to death in the classroom.
Right.
He is in a room with hostages who he will kill during the 77 minutes that no action is taken inside the room, and some of whom will bleed to death. But it's easy to look at that and go, well, those guys were just sissies or they weren't well trained or whatever. That was a leadership problem. And that's basically what the DOJ report concludes is you have a chief of police that doesn't know how to handle a situation. He misframes it. Everyone follows that framing. And then despite information that is contradicting the framing, they maintain this idea of a barricade. And there are a couple of just horrific examples that call into question the notion of a barricade. One of which, and I think I'll give you 2 that are just unbelievable. I went into the Uvalde interview thinking this is going to be bad. I had no idea how bad.
Really?
One of the officers who is in the hallway, his wife is in the classroom with the shooter bleeding to death. She calls him and texts him and says that she is bleeding to death. He attempts to enter the room. He's restrained. She bleeds to death in the classroom. 2 of the girls in the classroom call 911. There's room 10, room 12 are connecting rooms, and the suspect is kind of moving between the 2. So 2 of the kids that are in room 12 call 911 and tell them that their classmates are bleeding to death and that they're in there. And that information, although relayed, doesn't trigger them saying, wait a minute, there are hostages in there, we need to go. And there were certainly people having that conversation. I mean, if you watch all 77 minutes of that video, which I did, you see people pacing back and forth and very animated and very frustrated. But that is a leadership problem. And we are going to continue to have those leadership problems until we start training police leaders, how to make difficult decisions and supporting them when they make the wrong choice.
Right. And that's what I was going to get at is what's the takeaway here? Are we putting the wrong people in leadership positions? Is there no training available? Are we not focusing on it? What do we need to do to fix that?
I think it's both. I think that we are selecting law enforcement leaders in part because, we're picking people that stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
And the problem with picking people that stay out of trouble is the people that find trouble are generally speaking the ones we want doing police work. It is no longer, there's no longer an incentive to be an aggressive police officer. There's no longer an incentive to go out and, proactively look for work and proactively
got that one right. That is true,
find trouble
for sure.
Right. Yes. I mean, that's really what we want our police to do is find trouble.
Yeah. That's what they're paid to do. I mean, they're paid to go find the bad guys and arrest them. That's why we have them.
But the problem is that when they make a mistake, which there's 100% chance they will do when they're proactive, right? They're going to make mistakes. Rather than saying, hey, lesson learned, let's figure out how that doesn't happen again. Let's train that. What we do is we go, well, that guy's an idiot and we need to get rid of him. And so frequently what happens in agencies are the guys that are promoting to leadership positions are the guys that have avoided difficult assignments.
Yeah.
They're the guys that have avoided, working SWAT, working narcotics, working street dope, working aggressively in patrol. And so you end up with a group of leaders who do not have a great deal of field experience. They have a lot of administrative experience, and they have been incentivized to not make decisions.
Yeah, that's a
That
good
is
point.
not what we want them to do.
For sure. So what are your thoughts on this? This is something I see with the agencies that I work with, especially in this day and age. Apparently we've made it not a field that a lot of people would want to go out and work in, law enforcement. We have trouble recruiting. We have trouble with retention. And every agency that I work with is significantly low on numbers. And one of the agencies I work with, I've never seen them as low. There's always fluctuations, but it's crazy how low their staffing is at the moment. So one of the things we're seeing is we got young officers that 5 years ago would still be considered a rookie, and they're now with a couple of years experience being promoted to leadership positions.
Yep.
And a lot of these, they're just kids, a lot of them, and they not only do they lack the experience on the job, but they also just lack general life experiences. So that's another problem in leadership that I'm seeing. And how do we address that? Well, because I don't have a problem with I've never been one to choose a leader based on solely experience. But how do we get with some of these young guys that are being forced to grow up quickly and become a leader? What do we got? What kind of training do we got to get to them before we stick them in those roles?
Yeah, I mean, right now I would say nationwide it's about 20% is kind of where most agencies are. Tactical units all over the world are 20 to 25% down. And it creates a lot of problems, right? One, you have guys that are working forced overtime now, guys that, the guys that are willing to take the job, you're exhausting and you're not growing the force. And why would you, right? Why would you want to be a cop right now when we are vilifying you when you make mistakes? We're not supporting you. We're not funding you well. And we're promoting, in a lot of cases, people that shouldn't be leading you. There is a great deal of experience that comes with gray hair, right? Like it's funny because I didn't realize the wisdom of systems that made, experienced, older, less aggressive leaders make difficult decisions, because you are much more inclined to think about, a variety of factors. And if you look at everything we're doing as kind of recognition-based decision making, where you see a set of facts and you go, well, this set of facts looks like this, and from there you draw inferences. If you don't have experience, you can't recognize those situations.
Yes.
And when we're vilifying cops and punishing them when they are aggressive, we encourage them to hide. Go somewhere and do nothing, and that's how we're going to promote you. And we're not teaching leadership in any way, shape, or form, right? It's like, oh, well, you're a sergeant now. You go through this. You're a sergeant. School.
You're in charge. Yeah. Don't
Here,
screw up.
Go to this 1 week school, and good luck. And oh, by the way, if you screw it up, we're going to fire you. So, what you've done is you've created an environment where making a decision is dangerous.
Yes.
Not making a decision is a safe course of action.
Yep.
Unfortunately, if you're a hostage in a house, you need police officers to make decisions. Waiting until you get killed. I was using the example of dropping a match on a carpet. If you make the decision immediately and step on it, it's pretty easy. Give it 10 minutes. It's an entirely different problem.
Yeah, kind of an art of war quote there. Do what is difficult while it is easy, kind of philosophy. Yeah.
But the thing is, if you know that I'm going to second guess your decisions, and I have not trained you how to make difficult decisions, and I'm going to, after the fact, take that young sergeant who had 5 years of experience and had never seen this situation before, and I'm going to Monday morning quarterback everything he did, right, and take away qualified immunity, which is obviously a big trend right now, is to try and get rid of qualified immunity. And, we're going to make this guy pay. Well, guess what? He's just not going to make a decision, because not making a decision is safe.
Yes. There's so much to unpack with that one, because that's the leadership aspect from the top. How are they treating this? How are they dealing with it? that gets into, I mean, just look at the comments on some of the videos on my channel from people that don't know anything about the law, that, want to abolish Terry v. Ohio. And just, I mean, some of the comments are just so bizarre that it's, I can't even really respond to them. And we're going to have some on this episode for sure, because of some of the topics we're talking about here. But like you said, why would anybody want to do it? That's another problem with recruiting. New Mexico abolished qualified immunity. They didn't. It was a myth, because the state can't pass a law to take away what how the federal courts are going to handle a 1983 case. So it's a myth. They, in no way, shape, or form did they do it. But people think that, and it's hard to recruit. So now you have a totally different atmosphere. The way I approach it is through training. I want you to know the law as well as an attorney. They don't like that, because they don't want to be associated with attorneys. But I tell these young guys, if you want to be successful today, you have to know the law like an attorney. Prepare in all of your training, because when you get thrown in that stressful moment, that's that you're going to have a second to react. And I want you to make decisions. I want you to be proactive. And the only way you can do that and minimize your exposure to all the nonsense out there is by being smart and knowing the law. So that's how you can, that's kind of how I approach it. But the problem is that's filtered in so much, like what you're saying right now, that it's also led to kind of one more area I want to talk about, and that's wellness. I mean, the reason I'm doing this now is because I got burnt out to a crisp being a prosecutor, and I see the same thing in law enforcement right now. It may be even worse, because the way they're treated by the media, we forget that they're actually people. They live in your community. They've become a them and us against them kind of thing. You've talked about wellness on your podcast. What do agencies need to be doing? What do individual officers need to be doing? I'll give you an example. I had a training the other day, night shift. First of all, I hate it when I have night shift coming to do an important class in the morning because they're tired. They dealt with a homicide case the night before that was just something out of a horror movie. Someone was beheaded, and they come to class, and I'm like, go home. You don't need to be here today for a DWI training. Go home. But they're, oh, we can handle it. We're good. I'm like, no, go home and take care of yourself, and then we'll get you rescheduled. What do you need to be focusing on for wellness? How do agencies do it? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you've talked about it at length on the podcast in some really good episodes.
Yeah, so this is a topic that is fortunately starting to get more attention, but the majority of people that I interview for after actions have been through really traumatic experiences, right? I mean, shot multiple times, had to shoot somebody, had a partner killed, and the one recurring theme of everyone I've interviewed is it is not the event that traumatized them, it's their agency. They expect to get into difficult situations. But what really destroys the individual officers and they really struggle with are their agencies treat them like criminals after the event, right? So you've been in a shooting, you've had to take somebody's life. I don't care who you are, there's an effect there. And I deal with everybody from tier 1 teams down to local police departments. And I've yet to ever meet anyone who killed somebody and said, no, I didn't care. It didn't matter.
Right.
There's an effect there. And you look at the way most agencies handle it. Frequently, they don't have a plan or a procedure for what happens when they have an officer-involved shooting, or especially a line of duty death. They treat it like a crime. So they sequester the officer by himself. They tell him not to talk to anybody, right? Obviously, he's got to get legal representation now. So we're going to treat him like a criminal. We're not going to let him talk to anybody. We may send him home by himself. We're going to put him on admin leave. We're going to take him away from his tribe. We're going to tell his teammates that they're not allowed to call him. So now you've given somebody's had a traumatic event. You've isolated them. You've taken them out of your tribe. You've treated them differently. You frequently have treated them in a way that they did not expect. And then you wonder why these guys end up having drinking problems, or they don't want to come back, or they retire on stress. Especially when an officer has been seriously injured, and it's going to be a year or 2 years before they come back to full duty status. The agencies screw this up. I use the example of San Bernardino, and if you haven't listened to the San Bernardino episode, it's an officer-involved shooting. Those officers were ridiculously poorly treated by their agencies. Jordan McWilliams is an RCMP officer that was charged with murder.
Yeah, that episode was eye-opening, and that's exactly what happened in that case.
Yeah, I mean, it's, recently there was the Tree of Life Synagogue incident several years ago in Pittsburgh. That team was put under a 5-year federal gag order and told not to talk about it. So, it is, and I don't think agencies set out intentionally to harm their officers. I think that they're unprepared. I don't think that they have a procedure. I think that they freak out. But like the number of officers that I know that have been shot in the line of duty where their families have found out on TV or because somebody else called them and said, "Oh my God, is he going to die?" Like it is appalling. And it's not that hard, right? It's not like we haven't had thousands of officer involved shootings and there can't be best practices, but there aren't.
Yes.
And, the other thing that kind of ties back to what we were previously talking about is we have an expectation that our police officers are going to be perfect. We do not expect that from doctors, right? Doctors kill people all the time. They kill people so often that they carry malpractice insurance. So when they do it, somebody can pay the bill.
Yep.
And yet we don't look at a surgeon that makes a mistake and say, "Oh, he's a murderer." We look at a surgeon who made a mistake and go, "Yeah, no, he made a mistake. He was doing his best." But we don't offer that grace to police officers. And it's kind of insane if you really think about it. They're making split-second decisions where lives hang in the balance and they're going to make mistakes. We need to adopt an approach more like we have with surgeons, where there is this idea that, yes, there is going to be a certain amount. It's terrible every time it happens. I am a very pro-Constitution guy. I believe very strongly in the Fourth Amendment. We should never be deprived of liberty without due process. That's going to happen. But when it does, we can't take a 23-year-old sergeant and hang him out to dry and treat him like a criminal and, separate him from his tribe and then fire him because he made a mistake or commanded someone that made a mistake.
Right.
And we really need to redo our approach.
Yeah, and certainly there are instances where there is a police officer murders someone. That's pretty clear. The 100%. Investigation plays out. The feds will get involved. You're going to get charged under 242. But by and large, most of these things are these split-second decisions like you're talking about. And I'll tell you what, if you're an agency, if you're a supervisor, you're watching this podcast, take a look at how you're doing your use of force review. It is astonishing to me when I work with an agency on their use of force review and they have no real set way to do it. One sergeant does it, sends it to another one, and then they literally will come to a conclusion on this was a bad shoot. But they focus on tactics, our policy things, all things that are not going to be considered by the law. Now, certainly there can be reprimands for not using your duty gun or for policy violations, but when you're doing a use of force review and you're using things that are not considered in the law, and then what happens is, like you said, we treat the officer like shit and they get put on admin leave, and then when it finally has its day in court and they bring a police practices expert in, they're like, "Agency, you didn't review this under the proper standard. I don't see Graham in here. You just focused on tactics and policy." Then it gets overturned. And then now you have an officer who's now filing a lawsuit against their department, getting back pay, getting reinstated, toxic work environment. And I see that all the time.
Well, and what does it tell the, like you think about, so you have an officer who has been in a traumatic situation, right? Is feared for his life, like thought he was going to be killed or someone else was going to be killed, taken, deadly, applied deadly force successfully or unsuccessfully, then been treated like a criminal because he's now under criminal investigation. He knows the district attorney, especially in LA, is going to look at him and maybe charge him with a crime. He's maybe going to get sued. He's going to be put on admin leave, separated from his tribe. His coworkers are going to be told not to call him. And even if they're told not to call him, it's going to be awkward for them to call him because they're not going to know what to say. You have disrupted every aspect of that person's life right after they've had a traumatic event. And then you get to the end and you go, "Oh yeah, sorry." Right? That sorry doesn't cut it there. Like, and you can see why the suicide rate is so high. You can see why the litigation rate is so high, why retention is such a problem. We cannot continue to treat our law enforcement like this and expect that they're going to have healthy careers and are going to stay in the job. We don't pay them that well.
Yep.
Right?
I like where you went with
we
this.
Don't want to.
We talked about wellness, and almost every podcast that you'll go pull up on wellness, we're going to talk about meditation and those employee wellness programs and taking time off, which is important. You got to have that stuff. But I'm with you. I think the number one area, and as a matter of fact, I knew we were going to be talking about this. I don't know have you ever read this book by Paula Davis? It's called Beating Burnout at Work. She was an attorney, and she kind of, I found out because her story is similar to mine, total burnout, but she does the same thing. It's like, we focus on all these wellness things, but it's really a leadership problem. And you beat burnout by having good leaders in your organization, and you have the team aspect. She talks about, for example, something I've experienced where I'll do a training and there'll be a young officer. I'll ask a question. You know, once I said something about an OR bond, own recognizance. Young officer raises his hand. What's an OR bond? And then a sergeant in the class decides to, basically start making fun of this guy because he doesn't know what an OR bond is, and everyone's laughing. So what are the odds that this young kid's ever going to ask any question about anything again, because he's, fear of getting ridiculed. So do we have good leaders in place? Do you have an environment where people can debrief, talk about things safely without worried about getting yelled at or getting punished by admin? I think that's huge. And that's where I go with wellness as well when I speak on it, is it's not just vacation time and overwork. It's the work environment. It's the leadership.
It's funny because at its core, leadership is an act of love, right? What we want from our leaders is for them to care about us. And it is amazing how often leaders send the exact opposite message, right? You talk to guys that have been in traumatic events and you go, like, tell me the bad, tell me the good. The one thing they all come back to is, Jordan McWilliams, who's going to be charged with murder by, so Jordan's dad had worked for the agency that Jordan worked for. Same with Jordan Robinson, actually, interestingly. Both of them, their dads had worked at that agency. They had known the agency their entire lives. Right? This was their family. This was part of their family. And yet the chiefs of police don't go by and see them. Right? Jordan tells the story of the chief from the local agency where the shooting occurred coming by his house the next day and saying, "Hey, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate what you did for our community." This is changing somebody's life. And as a leader, it's very easy to go, well, he'll be fine. He's a big, tough guy. Bullshit. Right. Your job as a leader is to care about the people that work for you. And if you don't care about them, you need to find a different job. And the problem right now is as we are promoting people who are not good leaders and we're not spending time teaching them to lead, we're getting managers who are focused on statistics and numbers and what time did you get to work. And human beings are led. We're not managed. Yeah. Right? Machines are managed. Computer systems are managed. Human beings are led. And the only way we're led is when somebody cares about us, invests in us, and wants to ensure that we're going to do well. And there's no time that you need that more than after a traumatic event.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you an example, too. One of my clients that I work with is a police legal advisor. I won't say their name, but I'm sure the chief will watch this podcast, so I'll kind of give him a shout out. But he's one of the best leaders I've ever worked with. He recently took over this department, and it had its fair share of issues with officer-involved shootings. One of the first things he did was bring me in to teach him the law, and it was astonishing how little they knew about the law and how much progress we've made in the last year. But I see, especially with other agencies that I work with, how well a police department can run with a really good leader at the top. I mean, the community loves him. He wants to enforce the law, not back off, but he wants to be smart about it and improve community relations. We're not just going to go out and catch the bad guy, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't violate people's rights. And our officers are going to be highly trained. And he's totally bought into you guys will know the law like an attorney. And if you don't, you're just going to continue training until you get to that higher standard. So I've seen it. When you have good leadership in play, it makes the department run really, really smooth. And, it's not to say the other clients that I work with, good leadership as well, just been standard. But this was something where I literally saw the change on how quick it happened.
No, you can, the culture of an organization is all derived from the top of the organization. The way the senior leaders in an organization treat their people, the way that they interact, the things that they hold as important, the actions they take set the culture for the organization. And if you're not focused, I would say culture is like a reputation. You have one whether you want one or not. And if you're not paying attention to it, it's probably not a good one. And you know, it's a lot of what I teach is culture-centric leadership, and is rooted in trying to build the correct culture for an organization. And the leadership is so critical to that. And we've just kind of given up leadership as a discipline, right? We spend a lot of time now teaching, and this is true of the legal aspects. We teach a lot of times teaching the how. You're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? This is what you do on a Terry stop. This is what you do on a warrant. What we don't spend enough time is teaching the why. We're training, we're not educating. Yep. And the why is so critical, because the why helps you understand the next step away from the how.
Yep.
Right? If I understand that what's important to this agency is constitutional policing, is caring about the community, then that drives a very different mindset than if you're just telling me, hey, just go out and write tickets.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Well, John, I was shooting for 30 minutes. We're closing in on an hour. There's one more thing I want to talk about, because you're an attorney and you've had a lot of experience in working. I think you worked at the city attorney's office in LA at a very tumultuous time, and in what you do now. What are some things or some lessons you see specifically with legal issues with officers, departments? What are some things that come up, things they need to focus on?
I think teaching the why, teaching the understanding knowledge of Constitution and why do the courts find the way that they do, right? It's one thing to say this is what the court said. It's a different thing. You go back to kind of basic law school education, right? It's not just the finding, it's the rationale for the finding that matters.
Yeah.
And I think that from a legal standpoint, we need to spend more time teaching officers why the courts are finding the things that they are, and helping them to understand the kind of fundamental legal concepts that flow out of it. I think that agencies need to spend a lot more time preparing for catastrophe. I think that, especially, I can't tell you how many agencies I've seen get it wrong in a critical incident. Not only from an employee wellness standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from the amount of information they release, what they release, how they handle the information, how they conduct their interviews. And a lot of it is just they don't know what to do. So I think it is really important now for every agency to prepare for a line of duty death, to prepare for an officer involved shooting, to figure out ahead of time, what do those procedures look like and who conducts them?
Yeah.
And how are we going to treat the family, and who's going to do that? Right.
Yes. Another thing that I've noticed in this day and age, if you're a department and you don't have a police legal advisor, what are you doing?
It's crazy.
Some agencies, as a matter of fact, I don't know, Albuquerque may have one in-house, but I don't think any agency in New Mexico has an in-house one. I contract with a few agencies. Some of them are smaller. But even if you are a smaller agency, do you want to pay out $5 to $10 million in lawsuits, or do you want to bring in a really good attorney and have them in-house? Yeah, you got a city attorney, but they're busy. They're a general practicing attorney. You need to bring someone in that can work directly with your department. That's all they do. I think that's a really important thing to have going forward. I think that's going to be a field that explodes for attorneys. You're going to see more and more departments bring them in.
Well, it's funny, Eric, because what I always tell agencies is you have to recognize that the opposition is very well organized.
Yes.
Right. The groups and individuals who make their living suing police departments are professionals at that. They prepare ahead of time. They prepare legislation ahead of time, waiting for the next George Floyd to walk through the door so that they can take advantage of it, right? It's the same thing with the anti-gun lobby.
Yes,
they're waiting
prepared
for the next mass shooting, and then they're going to move.
Yep.
And so you're dealing with specialists on the other side. And yet,
and there's a lot of money to be made. So you better bet they're prepared. And these aren't your local, attorneys that you deal with on a speeding ticket. These guys are getting paid millions of dollars. So they are top of the line.
Pros.
They're good.
Yeah, they're pros. They're professionals. They're organized. They're very well trained. They share information freely with each other. You have an organized opposition full of specialists. So the idea that you would not yes, a city attorney is essential, but a city attorney is not a police litigation lawyer.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where an agency needs to be prepared ahead of time, already have those relationships established, have someone they can turn to. So when they do have an officer involved shooting, so when they do have a problem, they can turn to somebody who is an expert in that.
Yep.
Not also handling slip and fall and city contracts and public works. You need to, and this is true across the board. If your agency is not prepared for catastrophe, if you don't have counselors that you can reach out to, if you don't have, legal specialists that you can reach out to, if you don't have a medical director that's helping you build an effective, TIMS or TCCC program, you are making a mistake. And yes, you may get away with it for a long period of time, but I can tell you that when it stops working, you end up on my show.
Yeah.
and we end up talking about how, no, we didn't really have a medical program. I'm writing a column right now for the National Tactical Officer Association called Lessons Learned from the Debrief. It's the same class that I taught this year at NTOA. I decided to go positively rather than negatively. I didn't want it to be, here's what everybody did wrong over the last, couple of years. But I will tell you that the difference between an agency being well prepared for a catastrophic event is, generally speaking, somebody's life. It's their livelihood. It's their career. It is preventing a suicide, is preventing an officer dying from an injury that should never take their life. And nobody ever looks back and thinks, man, we were too prepared for that.
Right. Well, you said it. You don't really want to be a guest on your podcast because that means something has happened.
Nope.
And honestly, we're coming up on an hour. There's so much more we could talk about. So you know what that means. You're going to probably have to come back on here again.
Anytime, buddy.
One last thing I want to do, since we talked about the podcast, where can people find it? I'm sure it's on all the podcast apps. You're on YouTube.
Yep. All your traditional platforms. The debrief.live is the website. One thing I didn't mention, I probably should, is this year we've partnered with the California Association of Tactical Officers. And for several of our critical incident reviews, they're producing decision-making exercises.
Excellent.
And so these DMEs are tabletop exercises that you can sit down with your agency or team, play in a briefing training that put you in the position of being the officer who is responding. The first one we released was Parkland, which was this year's, the season 4 premiere episode was Parkland. And we put you in a position of having to make decisions, and you sit down in a small group and you tabletop.
I like it.
And decision-making exercises are so critical because it helps you to prepare ahead of time. So we're going to do 4 or 5 of those per season. Like I said, in partnership with the California Association of Tactical Officers, they're building the exercises, and you just sit down, you hit play, you hit pause when you're told to hit pause. You have a discussion. It is the kind of thing you can bring a legal advisor into, you can bring a tactical advisor into, you can bring your medical advisor into, and pre-run these situations so that when you are stuck with this kind of a problem, you've already thought about it ahead of time. So the debrief.live is the site, and as always, we are very open to feedback. If somebody has ideas, they can click the link and send us suggestions or criticisms or ideas for future guests or whatever, because it really is a labor of love, and we just want it to do as much as we can to promote officer safety.
Hell yeah, brother. Well, you're doing good work out there. I think the podcast, it's not just you're thinking, I'm going to listen to this long, boring podcast. No, it's great because you've tapped into what I teach the prosecutors that I work with is you got to tell a story. And I've taken road trips listening to your podcast for hours, kind of got to my destination. I don't want to get out of the car because I got to hear how it ends. Yeah. So they're good stories. There's lessons to be learned, and the format's really good. So you should definitely check it out, the Debrief podcast. I highly recommend it. It's probably my favorite podcast in law enforcement. There's a few that I listen to. So thanks for coming on. Appreciate it, John. And yeah, we'll have to have you on here again because these are always a wealth of information, and we're just kind of scratching the surface here.
Thanks, Eric. So if they're not listening to your podcast, they ought to be. Obviously, anybody that's going to hear this will be. But I appreciate what you're doing because ultimately, the good legal counsel is frequently somebody's freedom or their home or even their sanity. So I appreciate what you're doing as well, man.
Well, thanks, brother. Well, I guess we'll call it good on this one. Again, make sure you check out John's podcast, The Debrief. And I'm not going to tell you to subscribe to my channel anymore. I hit 10,000. I never thought I'd get that many, so we'll call it good. If you want to, you can. Leave me all your comments, all of them. Even we have a lot of people that aren't the biggest fans of law enforcement, but just remember, we're trying to teach them the law so they don't do all the bad stuff. But what comments do you have? Let's see it. All right, John. Well, I appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks, buddy. Take care.